Well, first of all, I'd like to thank those intrepid among you who stuck out to the very end to see me. I really appreciate it. It was a bit of an adventure getting here from Canada yesterday, but suffice to say I'm glad I was able to make it. So, a little bit about me. I have been doing computer security in one form or another for over 25 years. If I'm being totally honest, I started this back in the early 80s when in my school, my friend and I had figured out that our science teacher had a computer in the back room and we were actually duplicating video games and selling them to other kids in school. So, I had a rather nefarious upbringing, but that's another thing entirely. As I've been going through my career, I've had all sorts of different career options as I've gone along. I started out with a degree in classical studies and archaeology, so how did I get here? Long story, but I'll compress it real quick. I've done everything from working for a record company to being a system admin right through to being a CISO, and not a position I would ever consider to take again, but that's another thing entirely, because everybody seems to want to stick a knife in you at some point or another. So now I work for Akamai Technologies, and Akamai, for those of you who don't know, is basically a global overlay to the internet. And it is massive, to say the least. I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. But I should point out that I am Canadian. So I tend to get mistaken for an American. At one point I was in India not too long ago, and someone came up to me in a hotel lobby and asked me if I was an American. I said, no, I'm from Canada. And they said, oh, good. And then they left. I've never felt so out of sorts in my life. That was very disconcerting. And it's really interesting as I go around the world and I see the different views that people have about what a Canadian is, and I kind of just wanted to point out I'm not a lumberjack. But I do feel like this person. I feel like this consistently because out of all the jobs that I've had throughout my career, along the way I have kept notebooks. One of the mentors that I had early on, the first thing he said was carry a notebook with you everywhere you go. Write everything down. After 25 years, that stack is about this high. So I'm able to go back through there and pull out stories and talk about mistakes that I made, lessons learned, and be able to share that information through stories that I write for Forbes or CSO Online or various other publications. And one of the things that really gets me is that when I see these stories in publications where they're talking about various types of security issues, they tend to lean towards more of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. They'll talk about the security issues of, oh, this, that, and the other thing, and they won't talk about the security controls that were in the wrong spot. Or something like this. See if this works. So this is from an amusement park just north of Toronto in Canada where I live, and I took my family there, and my son saw this, and he just sat there in his stroller when he was one, actually about 1.5, watching this and didn't say a word. And then when we got back to the house, he went into the living room, picked up his little bucket of dinosaurs, walked over to my chair and put it behind there, and there it stayed for 2 years. Because he was convinced that was a real threat. No matter what I told him, he wasn't willing to believe it. And this is one of those things we have to make sure when we're having these conversations that we focus on the data. We don't get wrapped around the axle about the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So, to be fair, I've made that mistake in the past when writing articles for CSO Online. I wrote some articles which were entirely FUD, and I found out very quickly that I had gotten it wrong. I fell on my sword. But these other stories that I see, they leave me wanting. They really leave a gap. Because when we talk about those security issues, and then we see things like this with Petya, Netya, whatever you want to call it, these are built on problems that we've known about for a very long time. WannaCry was using a vulnerability that we had known about, documented for roughly a decade, and here we are trying to clean up the mess. And this is one of those problems that we have is accumulated security debt. And problems are going to pop up consistently. Like we'll see just recently in Canada, we had a couple of financial institutions that found themselves compromised. Or, it could happen here as well, and has happened in the past. And we have to take into account that when we're looking at all the different types of security issues, all the different types of attacks and things like that, we've got to worry about the data. Because as you know, the countdown has finally come to an end. So I will be going through and talking about some actions, actors, attacks, threats, that. So with Akamai, as I was saying, we were an overlay to the internet, and because of this overlay, we're able to see all sorts of data. We have roughly about 250 to 300,000 nodes that are live on the internet at any given point. And that number is continually growing. That's why I was really vague about how many we have exactly, because it really does change by day basis. And we see all of these attacks, and we're able to pull this data and see what is growing, what is the trend, what are the trends, and all that sort of thing. And it's really amazing that when you look at it and you crunch it down, this is just an example from our platform for a 1-hour time slice. You'll see up there the top attack was SQL injection. SQL injection is consistently the top attack quarter over quarter. Why? Because the attackers know it works. And I use that term very specifically because I consider myself a hacker, and anybody with a curiosity has that when I want to talk about criminal intent, like our friend from the FBI was talking about, you want to make sure that you're looking at that as opposed to the tool itself. So, actors for hire are one of the first things that I encountered when I got into this business, and this was really interesting. This was from a Russian underground site roughly about 3 years ago now, and it gave you different pricing for different types of attacks they could launch, including a DDoS botnet for $700. It wasn't clear if that was renting it or purchasing it outright, but suffice it to say, the numbers weren't that high, but compared to what they are now, that's really come down a lot, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So it's not all bad. There are actors out there that are doing good things. For example, this site, the Hackers List, who I have no affiliation with whatsoever, this was a gig economy type site where companies that had security work that needed to be done, they go here and they would be able to hire various folks. It's sort of like the Uber for hackers, I guess. And as luck would have it, roughly about 48 hours after the site went live, it was hacked and all the credentials were dumped online. So I give them credit for trying, and apparently they're still online, still working, and they recovered from that, so that's good. And as defenders, we have to constantly worry about what are the threat actors that you're having to contend with. By and large, the ones you're going to have to deal with the most are the bored kids. When I was a kid, luckily the internet wasn't a thing. I was still very much into cave paintings, probably explains my fascination with archaeology. And we go through this and we look at all these different things today where kids that have access to basically the world at their fingertips, it's incumbent upon us as security practitioners to make sure we have lessons or conversations with our kids so that they know the ramifications of what they're doing and understand the impacts, because a lot of the things that they do online where they may not understand it could really haunt them for the rest of their lives and or their career. Now, these folks really build up what I like to call is a disposable workforce. And this disposable workforce really does get employed heavily by chaotic actors, much like hacktivists. And these characters here, they justify it in their minds that this is okay because a lot of these kids tend to be under the age of majority in their respective locations. And so this is how they rationalize that it's okay to use this. And when you're looking at the types of actors out there, there's all kinds. You have to look at, come on. And we're frozen. Awesome. Oh, there we go. We have the standard villains, we have the arch villains, and we have the nation states. Now, our friend from the FBI earlier was talking about al-Qassam cyber fighters, and this group was really amazing. They were amazing insofar as this is the only hacker group I've ever seen that actually kept a timetable and stuck to it. When they would launch an attack, they would say, we're going to attack you on this day at this time for this amount of time. And they were like clockwork. They did it, and off they went. The really funny thing here that got me is they were going after U.S. financial institutions, but they also attacked Canadian ones. And then we were really kind of confused about this. So at Akamai, we started pulling different sources, trying to figure out why this was. And we found out, much to our chagrin, that they didn't understand that Canada and the U.S. were actually two separate countries. So they didn't get a gold star for geography on that day. The really interesting thing about al-Qassam cyber fighters is after Ahmadinejad left power, they ostensibly went quiet. Although the platform that we were using, Brobot, is still very much alive and well, and I'll talk about that a little bit more soon. And the attacks that we see going across our platform really are all over the place. We see volumetric application layers, protocol types of attacks, and when we boil it right down on a quarter-by-quarter basis, these three columns here are SQL injection, local file inclusion, and cross-site scripting. These are consistently the top three attacks we see going across our platform. Now, if you're one of our customers, not a pitch, if you're one of our customers, you're protected against these sort of things, but so many folks out there are not. And with SQL injection, if you are not sanitizing your inputs and sanitizing the outputs for your applications that are facing the world, you very much could end up in a very negative place. Something to keep in mind. And the attackers will throw things at you like the kitchen sink if they can get their hands on it. And this is one of those things where we have to understand that the barrier to entry for somebody to become an attacker has gotten so much lower. Much like our friend from the FBI was talking about earlier, this is the case. It has gotten so much simpler. And when you have a site where you're having all these e-commerce transactions, if you're not taking the steps to protect yourself, you could get bogged down very quickly. It could be the most beautiful site you have. You could have Flash on it. Don't do that. Thankfully, Flash is now being end-of-life, but I somehow think it's going to live on in various internal applications in perpetuity. So the attackers will use all sorts of different things out there. For example, here, this is showing ACK, DNS, NTP. Those of you who don't know, NTP is Network Time Protocol. This is an easy fix. If your NTP daemon, Network Time Protocol, is at current or N-1, you can't be used as a reflector for a distributed denial of service attack. If it is much older than that, you may be unwittingly participating in one of these attacks, and something to keep in mind. How long before law enforcement shows up and, oh, by the way, you were part of this attack? What are you talking about? I had no idea. Unfortunately, ignorance of the law is no defense. This is just too hard to see, so I won't do that one. So here is an example of quarter over quarter. We see the number of attacks per target that's hit. So here, at the height here in the Q3 of 2017, we saw 36 attacks per target. And this again, while it took a dip around Christmas time, has popped up again quite significantly. We're just going through that data right now, creating that report. And these attacks keep coming. Now, this particular diagram is really interesting because this used to be just black dots. It got to the point where it was just one sheet of black ink and it was completely unusable. So we had to plot them out based on, so down here you have the lower volume attacks going right through the higher, and then the number, excuse me, the intensity, bless you, the intensity goes across. And this is one of those things is, while it may show the slight trend here downwards, this has then gone right back up again, and it's just amazing they keep coming. And they'll even use old tools. So this is one of those things that really got me. Here in October 2016, we saw the Spike botnet, which is, Spike is an older tool. This is a tool that's been around for a significant amount of time, and still it was able to generate 517 gigabits of attack traffic at that point. And these attacks just keep coming. So here we see attack ostensibly on Deutsche Telekom. We're still not sure if they were double counting their data here. That's one of those things that we were never able to figure out. But here's the first Mirai botnet attack we could actually figure out. And it was about 2.5 million unique IP addresses that were used in attack, using IoT devices. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Now, when you're looking at the source countries for the attacks, we see, Canada, United States, Brazil, over here, our favorite friends that we like to talk about. These source attacks, sources are amazingly consistent, and the target is amazingly consistent as well. Every single quarter, the US is the top target. And a lot of that can be explained away where most of the e-commerce sites of a certain volume are based in the United States. Now, when we go through the data and we dump it out by vertical, this is really interesting. Every vertical is taking their share of the beatings, but when you get to gaming, it skews the data right off the screen. And that's somewhat frustrating because then everybody else goes, oh, well, our vertical's not so bad. Well, compared to gaming, yes, that's true. So if you break this out, SQL injection, local file exclusion, and cross-site scripting, which I was mentioning as the top 3 attacks quarter over quarter, and then you break it out by vertical, we see retail, hotel and travel, and financial services. Now, attackers used to go after financial services like crazy because they wanted the money. But as financial service organizations have gotten better at securing their data, where did the attackers go? They go over to retail. Same data that they were trying to get before, but by and large, retail organizations are not as advanced typically as what we have seen with financial organizations, and they will keep coming. Basically, it's by virtue of the fact that you have an IP address attached to the internet now, anybody will come looking for you. When you have tools like what we saw with MassScan, which is written by Robert Graham from Eratosec, this is a tool you can scan the entire internet in roughly 4 hours. The barrier to entry has gotten so low for attackers, it's amazing. And the attackers will try anything they can. This is one of my favorites, extortion. So there was a group, DD4BC, that would, very much in the same model that we saw from the al-Qassam cyber fighters, where they would attack sites and they would say, check your logs, we've attacked you, sample data, just trying to prove their bona fides. And they attacked quite a few sites, and unfortunately some of them paid the ransom. Here's an example of an email they sent to one of our customers. This is really amazing, the audacity. Here, they're saying, let us introduce ourselves, 3 articles that were written about them, or just Google DD4BC. So they have brand awareness as to who they are. Now it's your turn. Your servers are going to come under attack unless you pay 30 Bitcoin. That is a remarkable amount of money by today's standards, but at the time that was written, that wasn't quite so bad. Now, Europol was able to get the leader of DD4BC, and this person sort of dropped down a hole, and we never heard about him again. So, or her, actually. We don't even know the gender of this individual. But it was really amazing that people started going, oh, great, they're done. We're done with this. We don't have to worry about this anymore. Problem here is they had established a precedent. This was a business model that others could and would emulate, and did. Armada Collective was one of the ones that did this. This was a really amazing group in that for all the sites that they threatened to attack, they only ever attacked one that we could actually prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And they did that with a single home router doing an ICMP flood against a site, which has little to no effect in today's standards. They made roughly $100,000 US simply by threatening people using the same business model as what DD4BC had done. And it hasn't gone away. This is just from last year. This is a group here called Stealth Ravens that went after primarily companies in Southeast Asia and various other countries in that region. And when they would attack these sites, they would be able to hold them down because a lot of these institutions couldn't take 5 gigabits of attack traffic. They would fall over rather quickly. And those were possible because the attackers were using amplification attacks, using protocols like I was talking about earlier. And when we break it out here, quarter over quarter, DNS, NTP, and character gen. All right, so before I go any further, if you have a printer that is attached to the internet with a character gen port available, why? Please don't do that. This is one of the favorites that the hackers like to use, and I always am amazed at this. And I thought, how is this even possible? At one point, I had a vulnerability scanning vendor come to me and say, look, we'll scan your IP address space for free just to give you a sample of how our product works. I said, great. So they went and they scanned us, and then they came back with this nice thick report. They were a little bit upset because I gave them a Class B, but you know, I was working in power systems at the time. They came back, gave me the report, and I started looking through it. And I'm like, wow, I have a lot of printers in Shenzhen, Beijing, They had gotten one of the octets wrong in our IP block and had scanned a big chunk of Chinese IP address space. So this is one of those examples. A lot of times people don't know that they're swinging out there in the breeze. And the tools that the attackers have are really simple to use. Havage, this is one that's been around for quite some time. You can still find it. I've used this in a lab environment. Never use this on a system. You don't have permission to do it. If you use this against a system that has not had any protections put in place, this is very effective. It will dump the database really simply. It's really amazing. And there's also another one that's put out by OWASP. The name of it is escaping me at this point, but it's very similar. It's a great tool to test on your own systems. Now, being Canadian, I absolutely love our donuts, but this is a great tool because it's called Donut, was what really got me, but URL and start. The complexity here is about right just off the floor. It is so simple for any attacker to use it. And if you look back to the disposable workforce, if you had 100,000 people using this tool all at the same time, this has a rather significant effect. And the traffic that you see going through the wire is very much like any other web traffic, except there's just millions upon millions of requests. Now, the chaotic actors used this sort of idea, and they came up with what was at the time called low-orbit ion cannon. Now, this is going back quite a few years, and their first target was the White House. So they launched their attack, and you'll notice that there's all sorts of configuration options. The folks at the White House just changed the IP address, and the attack failed, so that was really interesting there. But the chaotic actors came back and said, we'll try this, the high-orbit ion cannon. Now, I'm going to go back one. See this? How much configuration there is? Now you just put in the target and go fire the lasers. And this was amazing that the attack type was a blaster pack that somebody could just install into the tool. They didn't have to have any sort of technical savvy to run this other than to be able to click a button. So it really made it easier for the chaotic actors to have a much wider audience. And then we look at stuff like this, where Brobot, which was used by the al-Qassam cyber fighters, this was based heavily on compromised WordPress installs. This was far more complicated. And this tool could pivot within 5 minutes. So when we were blocking an attack for a financial institution, they would pivot within 5 minutes to a different type of attack. And it was really amazing to see how quickly this system could adapt. But it's still out there and still idling. Now, the other thing that always drives me crazy is when I hear government types talking about various type of hacker tools and how we should make them illegal. The really easy way to dumb it right down is say, look, if I have a hammer, I can build you a house, or I can beat you about the head and neck. It doesn't change the fact that it's a hammer. So we really much, the earlier speaker was saying, we really have to focus on what the intent is here when you're looking at the crime. Now, when I was talking about earlier the Mirai botnet, this is a great example of a tool that should never have been able to work. Mirai botnet, now the code was put up here by a friend of mine, Jerry Gamblin, who put it up on GitHub when it was released, and he went through and he pulled out all the usernames and passwords. Root, admin, 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 drop down, root, admin, password. These are default credentials in 63 different devices that made up a botnet of 2.5 million devices. This should never have happened. This is a case of IoT vendors going time to market issues and trying to get their product out there as fast as they possibly can. Programmatically, there's no reason why when you pull out your toaster or your coffee maker or whatever, before you attach it to the internet, why? But before you attach it to the internet, it forces you to change your password. This is something that should never have existed. And then when it did, it caused all sorts of pain and suffering. And then there was the attack against Dyn. Now, the Mirai botnet was part of that attack, not all of the attack, and they themselves posted this as their outage map when their customers were compromised, or not compromised, taken out as a result of their DNS failure. Now, this is not to beat up on them in any way, shape, or form, but this is to highlight an issue that shouldn't have happened either. With DNS, if they had sole sourced their DNS to Dyn, the customers that is, then when Dyn went down, they went down. With DNS, you can have secondary or tertiary providers so that if you have multiple DNS providers serving up your IP space, if one goes down, you're still online. And unfortunately, this was a configuration issue that bit them rather hard. And these configuration issues keep coming back and over again. In February this year, incidentally on my son's birthday, this happened, Memcache. Memcache is a system that was designed by the folks at LiveJournal to, back in 2008 or something like that, or I could be wrong, 2008, that was meant to accelerate dynamic content on websites. Really, really cool system, but it was never meant to be exposed externally. Unfortunately, over time, these systems have become exposed externally, leading to 100,000 of them that led to this particular attack, which was 1.35 terabits of attack traffic. This would hold down basically any site on the internet that didn't have any sort of protections. The problem here is this was highlighted in research that came out at Black Hat in 2010. So for 8 years, we've known about these problems, but this problem wasn't addressed for whatever reason. So when we go through the data that we have on our platform, there are literally petabytes of this data. We're able to comb through it and look at all the different types of trends that come up. The one that always gets me are the media grandstanders. This has always been amazing to me when I see these attacker groups coming out and saying, oh yeah, they'll do press. There was one group called the Lizard Squad that actually did on-camera TV interviews. There was a couple of them that did that. If you were launching an attack as your first idea to get in front of a camera and claim credit for it, not the greatest thing. But the really cool thing about this is they actually did bring to light a greater understanding of the commoditization of distributed denial of service. These groups have built out these SaaS-based offerings where you can, for a little bit of Bitcoin, be part of an attack too. And it's really amazing to see how affordable that is. Now, these platforms were built out heavily on home routers and other systems like that that were easily compromised. Just actually yesterday in the news, we found out that Singtel had roughly 1,000 customers with the administrative interface on their home routers exposed to the internet and easily accessible. This problem does keep happening over and over again. It's an unfortunate one. Now, the Lizard Squad, they came out with their offering, which is SaaS-based, and they said it was all custom private code and all the really interesting things like that. But when we tore it apart, we discovered it was actually built exactly off the code from the Titanium crew. Now, the Titanium stressor, the progenitor of that, he actually went to prison not too long ago. And when they launched their site, they didn't have any htaccess files. And for those of you who may not be aware, an htaccess file controls who can access a directory structure on a website. So we were able to pull all the usernames and their accounts off of this before Brian Krebs wrote about it 2 weeks later, and I'm still bitter that I didn't actually click to sit down and write that up. But when I did go into the platform, it did give you all sorts of really interesting package options. Here, the one here in the bottom right corner, 7,200 seconds for $69.99 a month. That's US currency. Now, the really interesting thing is, how many people in here are coffee drinkers? Oh, okay, good. We got more than I thought. So, if you are drinking coffee at Starbucks, an Americano is more money per day, one Americano per day, than it is to run this service for a month. It is cheaper than a cup of coffee a day to be an attacker. And these platforms are built out on two main core pieces. One is a booter. Now, this comes out of the multiplayer online gaming community where you could knock somebody offline if they were doing a better job at Dig Dug or more recently Destiny or something like that. But the thing is, they realized very quickly it could take out 100,000 of their closest friends. Now, the other component of this is the stressor. They use this term as a legal artifact to say, oh, it's just a tool that we're providing. The funny thing is when I worked in financial institutions back in the 90s, this actually was a service that we would pay to have them throw junk data at our test websites to see how they would do under load. The problem here is there's really, really thin ice, and it didn't really work out for many of them who have now gone to prison. Some as recently as the Europol Operation Power Off. So we went through and we saw all these different types of platforms. The one that really got my coworkers and I giggling was the Big Bang Booter. And this is why. This is absolutely amazing. This is a video that we found online that was marketing their platform. These are the opponents that you have to deal with as a defender on a regular basis. And I will get to this in just a second. So here we go. So they talk about custom source code, which we've seen with multiple platforms. They tend to reuse the same code over and over again. Then they go, oh, you can hit like a boss. So they're building up your confidence level, like you too can be an attacker. There we go. And they have a boot page. So if you're having issues with whoever you're playing with in video games, you can take them out. Then untraceable servers. I've yet to see that work. Look up Onion Scanner if you don't believe me. 8 different types of attack methods, and my favorite, 24/7 friendly support. These are the folks that you have to contend with. This is how they see themselves as a business. It's really amazing. And it's not just the only type of trends that we see. And one other one that we saw, and our research guys in Florida found this, it was amazing, the WireX botnet. This was using about 300 different compromised Google applications from their Play Store. Each one of these applications would do exactly what it said it would do. So if you wanted to download one that gave you a ringtone or one that would give you a screensaver, it would do that. But under the covers, it was actually launching denial of service attacks as part of a botnet. And when you put your phone to sleep and put it on the side table, it would start going to work. This was roughly 700,000 nodes that were launching denial of service attacks, and I really, really hate to see the data bills for those particular phones. But this is just one example that we see of new things that are coming up, and I can only imagine this is going to get worse before it gets better. So there's other highlights, but the one right at the bottom that I wanted to get to was data breaches that fuel login attacks. If you are reusing your username and password on multiple sites, you can be running afoul of this in a rather horrible way. Down here we got PHP injection, SQL injection. SQL injection is something that I talk about over and over again because this is a solvable problem. Most of the major data breaches that we see today are either that or S3 buckets. If you are using AWS and you have an S3 bucket, never make it publicly available unless you absolutely have to. So many of these data breaches that I've seen that are talking about this, oh, we got hacked. I wrote an article about creating an S3 bucket on AWS. You have to actually, you have to set it so it's publicly available. By default, it is not. So these ones that are coming up and saying they've been hacked, this is one of those things where I have a real hard time with this. And these sites that get hacked and they have their stuff dumped online, you can end up in here, which is Troy Hunt's website, haveibeenpwned.com, where he keeps a whole database, a searchable database. You can, a searchable database of these different types of breaches. And when you look at it, this is from a year ago. This is a site called informationisbeautiful.net. And you go through, and it's a visual representation of all the data breaches. And then I did it for a couple days ago. So go back. This was a year ago. This is a couple days ago. And then there's the obvious ones that jump out at us. The one where we are all customers in Canada, UK, and the United States, but none of us wanted to be. And now the attackers are going to take those passwords and they're going to dump them online. They're going to find them, put them out, and you can get them from various different sites. This site was actually live until very recently. So all of these usernames and passwords would then be run through a tool like this, where the attacker's looking to see if they can gain access to other sites like your Amazon accounts, your iTunes accounts, whatever it happens to be. And this is an avoidable problem. And it's a strong, strong argument for two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. This doesn't have to be this way. The time of the password really is coming to a close in its traditional static sense. And if we're not taking the time to make sure that our sites are properly secured, we run the risk of becoming part of an undead army and being an unwitting participant to a lot of denial of service attacks. So what do you do? SQL injections, NTP. Make sure those two things are addressed, and that will actually take care of a lot of stuff right out of the gate. It's not a case of looking for a utopian security picture. You want to make incremental changes to make it better for all of us. Because if we're not taking the proper time to make sure we have proper security controls in place, things can go very badly, like they did with WannaCry. WannaCry was just amazing to me when it's a problem that we've known about for 10 years. So when you're looking at these stories and talking about the various information out there, you want to make sure that you're looking at it from a perspective of a data-driven conversation. Don't get wrapped around the axle on fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So all of the information in here is available at stateoftheinternet.com. We put out a quarterly report that is totally free and available to you to use as you see fit. And none of this would be possible without the help of the security researchers on our team that really were a great contributor to this talk. And that being said, just recently, I was in Hawaii for another conference, and I went surfing. I actually got up, just so we're clear. If I can do this, we can do a much better job of securing our environments. Thank you very much for having me.